Eliza Morgan stared at her reflection in the small hand mirror, her fingertips gently tracing the jagged scar that ran from her right temple down to her jawline. Once, she had dreamed of love and family like any other woman in 1880s Boston. Now, at 26, she had packed her meager belongings and boarded a westbound train, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride in Wyoming Territory. She had exchanged letters with a rancher named Matthew Harrington for 6 months. He seemed kind in his correspondences, and most importantly, he lived in a remote area where her past and her scars might not follow her. What Eliza didn't know was that Matthew Harrington had secrets of his own, secrets that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train rattled and swayed as it cut through the vast, open plains of Wyoming Territory. Eliza pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching as the landscape transformed from the dense forests of the east into the expansive, golden prairies of the west. Her hand instinctively rose to her face, fingers brushing against the rough, puckered skin of her scar. The familiar ritual provided little comfort as anxiety churned in her stomach. "Next stop, Clearwater Junction. Clearwater Junction, folks," the conductor called as he made his way down the narrow aisle. Eliza straightened her simple blue dress and adjusted the small hat she wore, tilted slightly, to provide shadow over the right side of her face. 6 months of correspondence with Matthew Harrington had led to this moment. His letters described a modest cattle ranch 20 miles outside of town, a life of hard work but peaceful solitude. He wrote with an eloquence that surprised her, describing sunsets that painted the sky in colors she could barely imagine and the scent of sagebrush after summer rain. What he didn't know, what she hadn't been able to bring herself to reveal, was her disfigurement. In her daguerreotype, she had carefully posed to hide the scar, ashamed of its presence and afraid that revealing it would end any chance at a new beginning. The train lurched to a stop with a screech of metal against metal. Eliza gathered her carpetbag and the small trunk containing everything she owned in the world. As she stepped onto the wooden platform, the hot summer air hit her like a physical force after the relative cool of the train car. Clearwater Junction was barely more than a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the newly laid railroad tracks. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other establishments stretched down a single dusty main street. People milled about their business, a few casting curious glances at the newcomer. Eliza scanned the small crowd, her heart pounding. Matthew had promised to meet her, but what would happen when he saw her face? Would disgust replace the warmth she had felt in his letters? Would he reject her outright, leaving her stranded in this unfamiliar place? "Miss Morgan," the voice came. From behind her, deep and pleasant, Eliza turned slowly, clutching her carpetbag like a shield. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin tanned from outdoor work. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and he wore simple clothing, a cotton shirt, suspenders, and worn trousers. He wasn't what she had pictured, somehow both. Younger and more handsome than she had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, but it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were a striking blue and completely unfocused. He wasn't looking at her, but rather slightly past her, his head tilted in a listening posture. "Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A smile spread across his face. "Matthew, please. It's good to finally meet you, Eliza." He extended his hand, but not directly toward her, slightly to the left. Realization dawned slowly. Matthew Harrington was blind. Eliza hesitated before placing her hand in his. His grip was warm and firm, calloused from ranch work. It's good to meet you too," she managed. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult," he said, releasing her hand. I've got the wagon just over there. My ranch hand, Thomas, drove me into town." He gestured vaguely behind him, where an older man stood beside a wagon, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "It was fine, thank you," Eliza said, still processing this unexpected development. Not once in his letters had Matthew mentioned his blindness. A mixture of relief and guilt washed over her. Relief that he couldn't see her scar, guilt for feeling that relief. "You must be tired and hungry. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. Thomas can help with your trunk." As they walked toward the wagon, Eliza observed Matthew. He moved with confidence, using a walking stick to navigate, occasionally brushing it against obstacles. Clearly he had been blind for some time. Thomas, a weathered man in his 60s with a silver moustache, nodded at her. "Miss Morgan." His eyes flickered to her scar briefly before he politely averted his gaze. "Let me get that trunk for you." The ride out of town was initially silent, save for the creaking of the wagon and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Eliza sat between Thomas, who drove, and Matthew. The vastness of the Wyoming landscape unfolded before them, rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains, the endless blue sky overhead dotted with towering white clouds. "I should have told you," Matthew said suddenly, breaking the silence, "about my condition." Eliza turned to look at him, studying his profile. "Yes, you should have." He smiled ruefully. "I was afraid you wouldn't come. Most women don't want a blind husband, especially out here where life demands so much." The irony wasn't lost on Eliza. "I understand keeping secrets," she said softly. She took a deep breath. "I haven't been entirely honest either." Matthew turned toward her voice. "Oh? I have a scar. On my face. It's quite noticeable." The words tumbled out before she could reconsider. "The photograph I sent was carefully posed to hide it." Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, pretending not to listen. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came all the way out here? Because of a scar?" "People can be cruel about appearances," Eliza said simply. Matthew nodded slowly. "Yes, they can." He turned his face toward the sun. "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" Eliza stared at the passing landscape. She rarely spoke of that night. "A fire when I was 18. Our house in Boston. I got my younger sister out, but when I went back for my mother..." Her voice caught. "You don't have to tell me," Matthew said gently. "The beam fell. I was lucky to survive." Eliza touched her face unconsciously. "My mother wasn't as fortunate." Matthew was silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry." The words were simple but sincere. "It was 8 years ago now," Eliza said. "My father remarried a year later. Her name is Vivian. She was always uncomfortable with my presence, my constant reminder of what happened, I suppose. And your sister, Anne, married and moved to California with her husband last year. With her gone, there seemed little reason to stay." Eliza didn't mention the increasingly pointed suggestions from her stepmother that she moved to a women's boarding house, or the pitying glances from former friends, or the whispering that followed her through Boston's streets. Matthew nodded. "I understand seeking a fresh start." "What about you?" Eliza asked. "Were you born?" She stopped, unsure of the polite phrasing. "Blind." Matthew smiled. "No. It happened 5 years ago. Cavalry service against the Sioux. A blow to the head." He spoke matter-of-factly. "By the time I recovered, the doctors said my sight was gone for good. I had already purchased this land before enlisting, so I came back and built the ranch anyway. That must have been difficult." "It was." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "I had to relearn everything. But I was stubborn. Still am, according to Thomas. Here," the older man chuckled, "stubborn as a mule with a burr under its saddle." As they traveled, Matthew described the ranch, The main house he had built himself, the barn, the corral, the small herd of cattle, and the 2 horses he kept. Thomas added details about the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, and the creek that ran along the western edge of the property. "It's not much compared to Boston," Matthew said, "but it's home." "It sounds wonderful," Eliza replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. After years of feeling unwelcome in her father's new household, the prospect of a place that could be hers, even shared with a stranger, was appealing. The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly the ranch lay before them. A modest but well-maintained house with a wide porch, a large barn, and various outbuildings. A split-rail fence enclosed a corral where several horses grazed. Beyond, cattle dotted the rolling grassland that stretched toward distant mountains. "Here we are," Thomas announced. As they pulled up before the house, a border collie came bounding around the corner, barking excitedly. "That's Scout," Matthew said, smiling as the dog approached. "My eyes around the ranch in many ways." The dog sniffed curiously at Eliza as she climbed down from the wagon, then gave a soft woof as if in approval. "She likes you," Matthew observed. Stepping down carefully, the dog immediately moved to his side. "Scout's very particular about people." "I've always been fond of dogs," Eliza said, reaching down to pet the collie's head. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Thomas unloaded her trunk and carried it onto the porch. "I'll put this in the spare." "Room for now, Miss Morgan." Eliza nodded her thanks, then realized Thomas was already entering the house. She stood awkwardly, suddenly unsure of what came next. The reality of her situation hit her anew. She was miles from civilization with a man she barely knew. Matthew seemed to sense her discomfort. "I know this is all very sudden," he said, "and not quite what either of us expected." He gestured toward the house. "Would you like to see the place? And then perhaps we can talk." Eliza followed him up the steps and into the house. Despite his blindness, Matthew moved with confidence through the rooms, occasionally trailing his fingertips along a wall or piece of furniture. The interior was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by sturdy, handcrafted furniture. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books. "You have quite a collection," Eliza observed, running her fingers along the spines. "From before," Matthew said. "I still miss reading. Thomas reads to me sometimes, but it's not the same as losing yourself in a book." "I could read to you," Eliza offered spontaneously. "I always enjoyed reading aloud to my sister." A smile softened Matthew's features. "I'd like that." He showed her the kitchen with its large wood-burning stove, the pantry stocked with preserved foods, and the 2 bedrooms, his own and the smaller guest room where Thomas had placed her trunk. "This would be your room," Matthew said, standing in the doorway. "For now, at least." The implication hung in the air between them. They were meant to be married, but neither had mentioned it since her arrival. "It's lovely," Eliza said, noting the handmade quilt on the bed and the small vase of wildflowers on the dresser, a welcoming touch that must have been Thomas's doing. When the tour was complete, they returned to the main room. Thomas had disappeared, tactfully giving them privacy. "Would you like some coffee?" Matthew asked. "Or tea, perhaps? I'm afraid I don't know your preference." "Coffee would be wonderful," Eliza said, touched by his consideration. As Matthew busied himself in the kitchen, again moving with practiced ease, Eliza studied him. He was not what she had expected, and certainly not what she had prepared herself for. She had steeled herself for disappointment, disgust, or at best, polite tolerance of her appearance. Instead, she'd found someone who couldn't see her at all. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. For years, she had wished people could look past her scar to see the person beneath. Now she'd found someone who literally could not see her disfigurement, and she felt strangely conflicted about it. Matthew returned with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her at the table. "I imagine you have questions," he said directly, "about why I didn't mention my blindness in my letters." "I do," Eliza admitted. "Though I understand the hesitation, I kept my own secret after all." Matthew's fingers traced the rim of his cup. "When I first placed the advertisement, I received no responses. Then I tried again without mentioning my condition, and you wrote. By then, it seemed too late to tell you. I was afraid you'd stop writing." He paused. "Your letters became very important to me." The simple admission touched her, as did yours to me. "I had Thomas describe your photograph," Matthew continued. "He said you looked kind." Eliza felt a rush of gratitude toward the old ranch hand, who must have seen her scar in the carefully posed photograph, but had chosen not to mention it. "About our arrangement," Matthew said after a moment, "I want you to know that I don't expect anything. You've traveled a long way, and this isn't what you agreed to. If you wish to return to Boston, I'll provide the train fare." "And if I don't wish to return?" Eliza asked quietly. Matthew's expression was guarded. "Then you're welcome to stay, under whatever terms you're comfortable with. The preacher comes through town every 3rd Sunday. Or you could simply remain as a companion and housekeeper if you prefer." Eliza considered his words carefully. She had come seeking a fresh start, an escape from the pitying glances and whispered comments that had followed her in Boston. Here was a man offering her choices, respect, and possibly a home. "I'd like to stay," she said finally, "at least for a while. As for the rest, perhaps we can take some time to get to know each other better before making decisions." Relief washed over Matthew's face. "I'd like that." As the afternoon faded into evening, they continued talking. Matthew described the ranch, how he had adapted to running it after losing his sight, the rhythms of the seasons in Wyoming. Eliza spoke of Boston, her love of literature, and her sister Anne. Carefully, they circled closer to the personal histories that had brought them both to this point, she escaping the shadow of her scars, he building a life beyond the darkness that had claimed his vision. Thomas returned as dusk fell, lighting lamps around the house before announcing that supper was ready. The meal was simple but satisfying. Venison stew, fresh bread, and apple preserves. "Thomas is a far better cook than I am," Matthew said with a smile. "Though I can manage breakfast without burning down the house. Miss Morgan likely has more refined tastes," Thomas said, eyeing her. "Not at all," Eliza assured him. "This is delicious, and please call me Eliza." After supper, Thomas excused himself to his quarters above the barn, leaving Eliza and Matthew alone again. A companionable silence fell between them as Matthew stoked the fire against the evening chill. "Would you like me to read to you?" Eliza offered, glancing at the bookshelf. Matthew's face brightened. "I'd enjoy that very much." Eliza selected a volume of Emerson's essays and began to read. Matthew sat with his eyes closed, a small smile playing at his lips as her voice filled the room. Outside, darkness settled over the Wyoming prairie, and inside, 2 strangers began the careful work of becoming something more. When fatigue finally overtook her, the words beginning to blur on the page, Eliza closed the book. "You read beautifully," Matthew said. "Thank you." "It was my pleasure," she replied, and found she meant it. Matthew stood, reaching for his walking stick. "I should let you rest. It's been a long day for you." At her bedroom door he paused. "Eliza," he said softly, "I'm glad you came." "So am I," she answered, surprising herself with her sincerity. As she prepared for bed in the small, neat room, Eliza caught her reflection in the mirror above the washstand. The scar was still there, of course, a jagged line etched into her skin, a permanent reminder of both tragedy and survival. But for the first time in years, it didn't seem to define her entire existence. Tomorrow would bring challenges, certainly. Life on a remote branch would be nothing like Boston. And this unusual arrangement with Matthew, whatever it might become, was uncharted territory for them both. Yet as Eliza slipped beneath the quilt, listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the prairie, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. Dawn broke early over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Eliza woke to unfamiliar sounds: roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the soft whisper of prairie grass stirred by the morning breeze. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She was at Pine Creek Ranch, 20 miles from Clearwater Junction, in the home of Matthew Harrington, a blind rancher who had advertised for a mail-order bride. Eliza dressed quickly in a simple work dress, pinning her hair in a practical bun. At the small mirror, she paused briefly, studying her scar in the morning light. The habit was deeply ingrained after 8 years, but for the first time, the scrutiny felt less important. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon drew her to the kitchen, where she found Matthew standing at the stove, confidently flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," he said, turning at the sound of her footsteps. "I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you," Eliza replied, surprised by the domestic scene. "Can I help with anything? The coffee's ready if you'd like to pour. Cups are in the cabinet to the right of the sink." Matthew expertly transferred bacon to a waiting plate. "I may be blind, but I can manage breakfast. Ranch work builds an appetite that waits for no one." Eliza poured coffee for them both, noticing how everything in the kitchen had its designated place, a necessary organization for someone who navigated by touch and memory. "Where's Thomas this morning?" she asked, settling at the table as Matthew brought over plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. "Already out checking the north pasture fence. A storm last week brought down some trees." Matthew sat across from her. "He's been with me since I returned from the war. I couldn't run this place without him." "He seems very loyal." "We look out for each other," Matthew said simply, his hands finding his utensils with practiced ease. "That's how it works out here. People depend on one another." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the distant calls of meadowlarks. "I was thinking," Matthew said eventually, "that you might like to see more of the ranch today. If you're feeling up to it, I'd like that very much," Eliza replied, eager to explore her new surroundings. After breakfast, Matthew whistled for Scout, who materialized instantly at his side. Together, they set out, Matthew holding Eliza's elbow lightly as they walked, Scout leading the way. The morning air was cool and fresh, scented with sage and wildflowers. Matthew moved with confidence across the familiar terrain of his property, occasionally asking Eliza to describe what she saw. "The grass stretches for miles," she told him, "golden in the sunlight. There are wildflowers, purple and yellow ones, dotting the hillside, and the mountains in the distance look almost blue." Matthew smiled, his face turned toward the sun. "I remember the colors. Sometimes I still dream in them." He paused. "What color are your eyes, Eliza?" "Thomas couldn't tell me that from your photograph." "Hazel," she answered. "More green than brown." "And your hair?" "Auburn. Dark red in some lights." Matthew nodded as if fitting these details into his mental image. "Thank you. It helps to know." They walked to the barn where Matthew introduced her to the horses, his own chestnut gelding named Rusty, and a gentle grey mare. "This is Willow," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's yours if you'd like. Every ranch wife needs her own horse." The casual assumption that she would stay, that she would become his wife, hung between them. "I've never ridden before," Eliza admitted, changing the subject slightly as she tentatively reached out to stroke Willow's velvety nose. "I can teach you, or Thomas can, if you'd prefer." His tone was careful, giving her space. "I'd like to learn," she said. From the barn, they continued to the chicken coop where Eliza collected eggs, then to the vegetable garden, which was surprisingly extensive. "We try to be self-sufficient," Matthew explained. "Winter supply wagons can't always get through when the snow's deep." As they walked, Matthew spoke of ranch life, the spring calving, summer haying, fall roundup, and the quiet isolation of winter. He talked of neighbors 12 miles distant who came for Christmas dinner, of the traveling preacher who stopped every third Sunday, of the town gatherings for Independence Day and harvest festivals. "It's a different rhythm from city life," he said. "Slower in some ways, more urgent in others. The seasons dictate everything." "It sounds peaceful," Eliza said, realizing she meant it. "It can be. It can also be dangerous and unforgiving." His tone was matter-of-fact. "Nature doesn't care much whether you live or die out here. You have to be prepared, vigilant." They created a small hill and Matthew stopped. "The creek should be just ahead. Can you describe it?" Eliza looked at the ribbon of water winding through a stand of cottonwoods. "It's beautiful. The water looks clear, and there are trees along the banks. Cottonwoods, I think. Their leaves are shimmering in the breeze." Matthew smiled. "This is my favorite spot on the ranch. In summer, it's cooler by the water. In winter, the trees break the wind." He paused. "I come here to think." They found a fallen log and sat, listening to the gentle burble of the creek. Scout bounded ahead, splashing in the shallows and emerging with a stick that she dropped hopefully at Matthew's feet. "She wants to play," Eliza said, smiling as the border collie wagged expectantly. "She always does." Matthew found the stick and tossed it with surprising accuracy. Scout raced after it, barking joyfully. For a while they simply enjoyed the tranquility, taking turns throwing the stick for Scout. Then Matthew turned toward Eliza, his expression serious. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand if this isn't what you expected or wanted. A blind husband on a remote ranch. It's not the future most women dream of." Eliza considered his words carefully. "What I dreamed of," she said slowly, "was a place where I could belong, where my scar didn't define me, where I could be useful and perhaps even happy." She touched her face unconsciously. After the fire, those dreams seemed impossible in Boston. And now? Now I think perhaps they weren't impossible, just waiting for the right circumstance. She watched the play of sunlight on the water. "You can't see my scar, but you know it's there. You accept it as part of me, not the whole of me. That's rare." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "When I lost my sight, many people could only see what was missing, what I could no longer do. They couldn't see what remained, what I could still become." His hand found hers hesitantly. "Perhaps we understand each other better than most." Eliza looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers slender and pale. Yea, simple connection felt right, a bridge across their separate solitudes. "I'd like to stay," she said softly, "to see if we could build something here, together." Matthew's smile was like sunrise. "I'd like that too." The moment was interrupted by Scout's sudden alert barking. She stood rigid, facing the direction they had come from, her ears pricked forward. "Someone's coming," Matthew said, rising to his feet. His posture changed subtly, becoming more guarded. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, and Thomas appeared on horseback, riding at a canter. He reined in sharply when he spotted them. "There you are," he called, dismounting. "We've got trouble, Matthew. The Carson boys spotted rustlers near the north boundary. They've already taken 2 heads from the miller's place." Matthew's expression hardened. "How many men?" 3, according to Jeb Carson. "Armed. Have you checked our herd?" Was about to. Then thought I'd better find you first. Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. We'll head back to the house. I'll get my rifle. He turned to Eliza. I'm sorry, ranch business can't wait. Of course, she said, suddenly aware of the realities of frontier life. Is there anything I can do to help? Stay at the house, Matthew said firmly. These men are dangerous. Thomas, and I will handle this. The pleasant morning abruptly transformed into tense activity. Back at the ranch house, Matthew retrieved his rifle while Thomas saddled fresh horses. Eliza watched from the porch, anxiety blooming in her chest. We'll ride the perimeter, Matthew told Thomas, checking his ammunition with practiced fingers. If we find them on our land, we'll drive them off. No heroics. Should I get word to the Carsons for backup? Thomas asked. Yes, but tell them to keep their distance unless we signal. No sense in anybody getting shot if we can avoid it. Eliza stepped forward as Matthew prepared to mount. Please be careful. His expression softened momentarily. Always am. We should be back by sundown. If we're not... He hesitated. Sheriff Taylor in town knows me. Send a word to him if necessary. With that ominous instruction, the men rode out, Scout racing alongside them. Eliza stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, the gravity of her new reality settling around her. This wasn't Boston, with its crowded streets and social properties. This was the frontier, where danger could arrive unexpectedly, and survival often depended on self-reliance and quick decisions. Alone in the house, Eliza found herself restless with worry. To keep her hands busy, she inventoried the pantry, swept the floors, and prepared a stew for supper, hoping the men would return hungry. As she worked, she pondered the events of the morning, the connection she had felt with Matthew by the creek, the sense of belonging that had begun to take root in her heart, and now this stark reminder of the precarious nature of ranch life. Mid-afternoon, with no sign of the men, Eliza's anxiety increased. She stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. The vast emptiness of the landscape, so beautiful earlier, now seemed ominous. What if something had happened? What if Matthew's blindness had put him at a fatal disadvantage against armed rustlers? The sound of approaching riders sent her heart racing. But it wasn't Matthew and Thomas. Instead, 3 unfamiliar men rode into the yard, their horses lathered from hard riding. They dismounted casually, as if they had every right to be there. Eliza retreated into the doorway, instinct warning her of danger. These men, with their unshaven faces and trail-worn appearance, were strangers, and given the morning's news, possibly the very rustlers Matthew and Thomas had gone to confront. "Hello, the house!" the tallest of the 3 called out. "Anybody home?" Eliza remained silent, her mind racing. Matthew kept a shotgun mounted above the fireplace. She had noticed it during their tour of the house. Could she reach it? Would she have the courage to use it if necessary? "Come on out, ma'am," the man called again, his tone friendly but his eyes cold. "We know you're in there. Just need some water for our horses and maybe a bite to eat." Taking a deep breath, Eliza stepped fully onto the porch. "I'm afraid my husband isn't home," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "But you're welcome to water your horses at the trough." The men exchanged glances, communicating silently. "Much obliged," the tall one said, touching his hat brim. "I'm Frank Wilson. These are my brothers Sam and Joe. We're passing through to Deadwood." Eliza nodded stiffly, not believing the introduction for a moment. "There's a pump by the barn. Help yourselves." As the men led their horses to the water trough, Eliza noticed one of them, the youngest looking, studying the ranch layout with too much interest. Another had a fresh bullet graze on his arm, poorly bandaged and seeping blood. They were lying. These were the rustlers, and they had already exchanged fire with someone, possibly Matthew and Thomas. Fear knifed through her, but Eliza kept her expression neutral. If Matthew and Thomas were hurt, or worse, she was alone against these men. Her only advantages were surprise and the fact that they didn't know the lay of the land as well as she did, limited as her knowledge was after just one day. "You said your husband's away," Frank asked casually as he returned from watering his horse. "That's a shame. We were hoping to ask about buying some beef for our journey." "He's due back any moment," Eliza lied smoothly. "He and our ranch hands. They've been checking the north boundary all morning." Something flickered in Frank's eyes, caution perhaps, or disbelief. "That's so. Well, we won't trouble you much longer, Mom. But a drink of water for ourselves wouldn't go amiss before we head out." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. Hospitality was expected on the frontier, even to strangers. Refusing might escalate the situation. "I'll bring a pitcher to the porch." Inside, her hands trembled as she filled a pitcher with water and gathered tin cups. Through the window she could see the men conferring in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the house. Whatever their intention, it wasn't friendly. Moving quietly, Eliza reached for the shotgun above the fireplace, carefully lifting it down. It was heavier than she expected, and she had no idea if it was loaded or how to check. Still, it might serve as a deterrent. She returned to the porch with the water and cups, the shotgun held visibly at her side. The men's expressions darkened. At the sight of the weapon, "That's not very hospitable, Mom," Frank said, his friendly tone gone. "Neither is lying about who you are and why you're here," Eliza replied, setting down the water pitcher but keeping the shotgun ready. "I know. You're not heading to Deadwood. I suspect you're the same men who've been rustling cattle from the neighboring ranches." The youngest brother, Joe he'd been called, laughed nervously. "She's bluffing, Frank. How would she know?" "Shut up," Frank snapped, his eyes never leaving Eliza. "Listen, lady, we don't want any trouble. Just give us some food for the trail, and we'll be on our way." "I told you, my husband and the hands will be back any minute," Eliza repeated firmly. "You'd best be gone before they arrive." Sam, the middle brother with the injured arm, shifted impatiently. "She's stalling, Frank. There ain't no hands coming. Carson told us Harrington only has one old man working for him, and the rancher's blind as a bat," Joe added with a smirk. "Easy pickings." Frank silenced them with a glare, then turned back to Eliza, his expression calculating. "Seems we all know more than we're letting on, ma'am. Now why don't you put that shotgun down before somebody gets hurt?" Eliza's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I suggest you leave, now." Frank's hand moved toward his holstered pistol. "I don't think—" The sharp report of a rifle cut him. Off! A chunk of wood splintered from the porch railing, inches from Frank's hand. "The lady asked you to leave," Matthew's voice rang out from somewhere to the left. "I suggest you do as she says." The Wilson brothers whirled, hands reaching for their weapons, but froze at the sound of another rifle being cocked. "I wouldn't." Thomas's weathered voice advised from the opposite direction. "My eyes ain't what they used to be, but I can still put a bullet through a man at this distance." Eliza nearly sagged with relief. Matthew and Thomas had returned, positioning themselves strategically around the house, using the rustler's focus on her as a distraction. Frank Wilson slowly raised his hands, signaling his brothers to do the same. "No need for bloodshed, we were just leaving." "Without your guns," Matthew ordered. "Drop them." With obvious reluctance, the Wilson brothers unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall to the dirt. "Now back away," Thomas commanded. "Toward your horses." As the rustlers complied, Matthew emerged from his position behind a water barrel at the corner of the house, rifle trained on them with uncanny accuracy. Scout stood beside him, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from her throat. Thomas approached from the barn, keeping his rifle ready. "I'll escort our guests off the property," he said grimly. "Make sure they don't circle back." Matthew nodded. "Take them all the way to Carson Place. Jeb can get word to the sheriff." As Thomas herded the disarmed rustlers onto their horses, Matthew made his way carefully up the porch steps, guided by the sound of Eliza's breathing. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern etched on his features. "Yes," Eliza managed, the shotgun suddenly unbearably heavy in her hands. "Oh, how did you know they were here?" Scout alerted us as we were heading back. We've been tracking the Wilsons all day, found where they'd cut our fence line. Matthew set his rifle aside and reached for the shotgun, gently taking it from her. Trembling hands. You handled yourself well. I was terrified, Eliza admitted, yet you stood your ground. There was admiration in his voice. That took courage. I was afraid they had hurt you, she said softly. Matthew's expression gentled. It takes more than a few rustlers to keep me from coming home. He hesitated, then added, especially now that I have someone waiting for me. The simple statement, laden with meaning, hung in the air between them. In that moment, standing on the porch, with the threat receding into the distance, Eliza realized something profound. This place, this remote ranch with its dangers and beauty, already felt more like home than her father's house in Boston had in years. And this man, who saw her with his heart rather than his eyes, had already become someone she couldn't imagine. Leaving. Matthew, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I've made my decision. If you still want me as your wife, I'd be honored to accept. Joy transformed his face as his fingers closed around hers. Nothing would make me happier, Eliza. Morgan, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the Wyoming prairie, Eliza stood beside the man who had offered her not just a new beginning, but a true home. A place where her scars, both visible and hidden, could finally begin to heal. The following Sunday, Reverend James Holbrook arrived at Pine Creek Ranch on his monthly circuit. A kindly man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and weathered skin from years of riding between frontier settlements, he greeted Eliza warmly when Matthew introduced her. Miss Morgan, it's a pleasure, he said, clasping her hand. If he noticed her scar, his expression revealed nothing but genuine welcome. Matthew mentioned in his note that you two are hoping to be married today. Yes, Reverend, Eliza confirmed, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that Matthew had said matched the sky. When she described it to him, and had pinned wildflowers in her hair, the ceremony took place on the front porch, where the afternoon sunlight bathed everything in golden warmth. Thomas stood as witness, Scout lying obediently at Matthew's feet. The words were traditional, the setting anything but, as birdsong and the gentle rustle of prairie grass provided nature's accompaniment. When Reverend Holbrook pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew reached for Eliza's face with gentle fingertips, tracing the contours of her features before drawing her into a kiss. His touch lingered on her scar, not shying away from it, but accepting it as part of her. Beautiful, he whispered, for her ears alone. Later, after a celebratory meal where Thomas revealed a hidden talent for baking with an impressive wedding cake, Reverend Holbrook departed with promises to return the following month. Thomas tactfully announced he'd be spending the night in town, leaving the newlyweds alone. As twilight deepened into night, Eliza moved about the main room, extinguishing lamps. Matthew sat by the fire, listening to her movements. "Are you nervous?" he asked suddenly. Eliza paused, considering the question. "A little," she admitted. "Aren't you?" Matthew smiled wryly, terrified. His honesty made her laugh, easing the tension. "At least we're both novices at this marriage business." Indeed. He held out his hand to her. "We'll learn together." She crossed to him, taking his offered hand and allowing him to draw her down beside him on the settee. The firelight cast shifting shadows across his handsome face, highlighting the strength in his features. "I want to see you," he said softly. "In my way. May I?" Eliza nodded, then realized he couldn't see the gesture. "Yes," she whispered. With infinite care, Matthew's hands moved to her face, his fingertips tracing her forehead, the arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her cheeks, the line of her jaw. He explored the contours of her face like a sculptor memorizing his creation, his touch reverent. When his fingers found her scar, Eliza instinctively stiffened. "Don't," Matthew murmured. "It's part of you, part of your story." His fingers continued their gentle exploration, following the jagged path from her temple to her jaw, a testament to your courage. No one had ever touched her scar with such acceptance. Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes, but for once they weren't tears of shame or grief. They were tears of release, of a burden carried too long finally set down. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Matthew's hands moved lower, tracing the curve of her neck, the slope of her shoulders. "You are beautiful, Eliza Harrington," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not despite your scars, but with them." She leaned forward then, finding his lips with hers, a kiss different from their chaste exchange during the ceremony. This one held promise, a beginning rather than a culmination. When they finally parted, Matthew stood, holding out his hand once more. "Come to bed, wife," he said simply. Eliza placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her toward their shared future. The seasons turned, bringing changes to the land and to the occupants of Pine Creek Ranch. Summer faded into a glorious autumn, the prairie grasses turning gold and russet under the October sun. Eliza learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and the physical labor, the satisfaction of work completed and the quiet evenings by the fire. She learned to ride Willow, initially clutching the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity, but gradually gaining confidence as Matthew taught her by voice and example. She mastered the art of baking bread in the temperamental wood stove, learned to churn butter, and planted an herb garden beside the kitchen door. And every night she read aloud to Matthew, poetry, novels, newspaper articles when Thomas brought them from town. Sometimes Matthew would reach for her hand partway through, his expression revealing that his thoughts had drifted from the story to the storyteller. On a particularly fine autumn day, as golden leaves swirled around them, Matthew brought Eliza to the creek where they had first acknowledged their growing feelings. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small carved wooden box. "Thomas helped me with the clasp, but I made the rest." Eliza opened it to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a small curl of dark hair. "It was my mother's," Matthew explained. "She died when I was 17. I've kept it all these years, waiting for—" He hesitated. "Waiting for the right person to give it to, I suppose." Eliza's throat tightened with emotion. "It's beautiful, Matthew. Will you help me put it on?" His fingers were deft with the clasp, finding their way with practiced ease. When the locket nestled against her collarbone, he pressed a kiss to the spot. "I never thought I'd find this," he confessed. "After I lost my sight, I resigned myself to a life alone. Even when I placed that advertisement I didn't truly believe," he broke off. "But then you came." Eliza leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, I think." As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Eliza marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few months. The scar that had once defined her existence now seemed incidental, a part of her story, but no longer its central feature. In Matthew, she had found not just acceptance, but celebration of her whole self. And in return, she saw not his blindness, but his extraordinary perception, his ability to understand people and situations with an insight that went beyond the visual. The ranch, too, had become truly home, a place where she belonged in a way she never had in Boston. The vast skies and open spaces that had initially seemed intimidating now represented freedom. The physical labor that had once exhausted her now brought satisfaction. The isolation that had concerned her now felt like blessed peace. Winter arrived, with unexpected ferocity in late November. One day the skies were clear, the next a howling blizzard descended from the north, blanketing the ranch in swirling white. "It's early this year," Thomas commented grimly as they huddled in the kitchen, listening to the wind shriek around the corners of the house. Could be a hard season ahead. Matthew nodded, his expression concerned. The cattle? Drove them to the South Valley yesterday, when I saw the clouds building, Thomas assured him. They'll have shelter from the cottonwoods and plenty of browse. It's the supplies I'm worried about. We weren't planning to stock up until next week's trip to town. Eliza mentally inventoried their pantry. We have flour, sugar, coffee and preserves to last a while. Smoked meat, dried beans and rice, too. How long do these storms usually last? Hard to say, Matthew replied. Could be a day, could be a week. It's not the first storm that's the problem. It's when they come one after another with no time to get to town between them. The first blizzard lasted 3 days, leaving behind snow drifts taller than a man in some places. Thomas and Matthew spent exhausting days digging paths between the house, barn and chicken coop, checking on the livestock and bringing in firewood. Eliza kept the stove burning, prepared hearty meals, and worried. A week of clear, bitter cold followed. Then another storm hit, worse than the first. This one brought not just snow, but ice, coating every surface with a treacherous glaze. When it finally passed, Thomas grimly reported that the path to town would be impassable for weeks. We'll manage, Matthew said with forced confidence. We've weathered worse. But as December progressed, their situation became increasingly precarious. The firewood pile dwindled faster than expected. Supplies of flour and coffee ran low. And Thomas developed a hacking cough that worsened by the day, despite Eliza's herbal remedies. It's just a cold, he insisted, waving away their concerns. But his face grew gaunt and his breathing became labored, especially at night. It's pneumonia, Eliza whispered to Matthew one evening after Thomas had retired to his room above the barn, his coughing audible even from the house. My mother had it once. He needs a doctor. Matthew's expression was grim. The nearest doctor is in Clearwater Junction. Even in good weather, it's a full day's ride there and back. And in this? Eliza gestured toward the window, where yet another storm raged. Impossible, Matthew admitted, at least for now, if there's a break in the weather. But the Wyoming winter showed no mercy. Storm followed storm, and Thomas grew weaker. He could no longer handle his chores, spending most days huddled by the fire, his breathing shallow and strained. I've been thinking, Eliza said one night, after they had helped Thomas to bed in the spare room, no longer willing to let him stay in the drafty barn. The Carsons' place is closer than town, isn't it? About 12 miles. Yes, but in this weather 12 miles might as well be 100, Matthew replied. Not if I take Rusty, Eliza said. He's the strongest horse we have. If I leave at first light, I could reach the Carsons by midday. Mrs. Carson might have medicine or no remedies, I don't. And if not, perhaps Mr. Carson could get through to town more easily from their direction. Matthew's face registered shock, then fear. Absolutely not, it's too dangerous. Thomas is dying, Eliza said flatly. You know it as well as I do. We have to try something. I'll go, Matthew insisted. How? Eliza challenged gently. You can't. See the landmarks, especially when everything's covered in snow. You could become disoriented, lost. Rusty is good, but he needs guidance in these conditions. Matthew's jaw clenched. I won't risk you, Eliza, and I won't let Thomas die if there's anything I can do to prevent it. She took Matthew's hand. I've learned this land over the past months. I've ridden to the boundary markers with you and Thomas. I know the way. They argued far into the night, but eventually Matthew conceded the logic of her plan, if not the safety of it. By morning, they had prepared as best they could. Eliza wore every warm garment she possessed, layered beneath. Matthew's spare coat. They packed a small bag with emergency supplies, matches, bandages, pemmican Thomas had made in the fall, and a flask of whiskey. The storm had finally broken, leaving a crystalline blue sky and a blinding landscape of white. The temperature had plummeted in the storm's wake, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. "Follow the ridgeline west until you reach Split Rock," Matthew instructed, as Thomas coughed painfully in the next room. "Then head northwest. Carson's place is in a valley protected by 3 hills. They call it Trinity Basin. You should be able to see smoke from their chimney once you crest the 3rd hill." Eliza nodded, committing the directions to memory. "I'll be back with help as soon as possible." Matthew pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "You must promise me something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If the weather turns, or if you become disoriented, turn back immediately. Don't push on out of stubbornness or courage. I can't lose you, Eliza." "You won't," she promised, though they both knew it wasn't a promise she could guarantee to keep. The Wyoming wilderness in winter was unforgiving of mistakes. With a final embrace and a kiss that held the desperation of their situation, Eliza mounted Rusty. The big chestnut gelding snorted, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I love you," Matthew said, his hand on Rusty's bridle. "Remember that, whatever happens." "And I love you," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I'll return before nightfall. Have hot coffee waiting." With that, she nudged Rusty forward, leaving the safety of Pine Creek Ranch for the vast, snow-covered wilderness. Matthew stood in the yard, his face turned toward the sound of hoofbeats until they faded into silence. The journey was more arduous than Eliza had anticipated. The snow was deep, forcing Rusty to high-step laboriously through drifts. The cold was relentless, seeping through her layers despite the bright sunshine, and landmarks she had thought she knew well looked alien under their blanket of white. By midday, she had reached Split Rock, a distinctive formation that marked the western boundary of their property. She dismounted briefly, stamping her feet to restore circulation and giving Rusty a rest. The silence was absolute, broken only by the horse's breathing and the occasional distant crack of a branch breaking under the weight of snow. As Eliza prepared to continue, a distant howl sent a shiver down her spine. Wolves. She had heard them before, but never when she was alone and vulnerable. Rusty's ears pricked forward, his body tensing. "It's all right, boy," she murmured, stroking his neck with a gloved hand. "They're far away." But as she remounted and turned northwest toward Trinity Basin, a second howl sounded, closer than the first, then a third from a different direction. The pack was hunting. Eliza urged Rusty to a faster pace, the gelding willingly lengthening his stride. The Carson Ranch was still hours away, and the short winter day was already beginning its slide toward dusk. If she didn't reach Trinity Basin before dark, she pushed the thought away, focusing on the terrain ahead. The snow-covered landscape offered few distinguishing features, and more than once Eliza had to stop and reorient herself, searching for the landmarks Matthew had described. The wind picked up as the afternoon waned, stirring loose snow into miniature whirlwinds. The temperature dropped further, the cold now a physical pain against any exposed skin. Eliza's face burned, particularly along her scar, which had always been more sensitive to extremes. When the howls came again, they were close enough to make Rusty sidestep nervously. Eliza scanned the horizon, finally spotting dark shapes moving. Parallel to her path, about a quarter-mile to the east, the pack was following them. "Faster, Rusty," she urged, giving the horse his head. The gelding broke into a canter, powerful muscles bunching as he plowed through the snow. The effort would tire him quickly, but Eliza calculated they were less than an hour from the Carson place, if her bearings were correct. The wolves kept pace easily, their lean bodies designed for this environment. Occasionally, one would veer, closer, testing, before rejoining the pack. They were assessing, waiting for the horse or rider to show weakness. As the light began to fade from the sky, panic threatened to overwhelm Eliza. She wasn't sure she was still on the right path. The terrain should have been rising toward the first of Trinity Basin's 3 hills, but the land around her seemed uniformly flat. Had she veered off course? Was she heading in circles? Rusty was tiring, his gait becoming labored, his breathing harsh. The wolves sensed it, drawing closer, their howls now silent as they focused on the hunt. Just as despair began to set in, Eliza crested a small rise and saw before her a distinct hill, the first of 3. Relief surged through her. The Carson Ranch lay just beyond the 3rd hill, perhaps 2 miles distant, but Rusty was at the end of his endurance, and the wolves knew it. As the horse labored up the slope of the first hill, the pack closed in, forcing Eliza to draw the pistol Matthew had insisted she carry. She fired a warning shot into the air. The wolves scattered momentarily but quickly regrouped, hunger overcoming. Caution! One bold male darted forward, snapping at Rusty's hind legs. The horse kicked out, narrowly missing the predator. Eliza fired again, this time aiming at the ground near the lead wolf. The bullet kicked up snow inches from the animal, causing it to leap back with a snarl. The standoff continued as they crested the first hill. In the dying light, Eliza could now see the second hill clearly, and beyond it just visible, a promising wisp of smoke rising from what must be the Carson's chimney. So close, yet with a failing horse and an increasingly aggressive wolf pack, it might as well have been miles away. As darkness gathered and the temperature plummeted further, Eliza faced the most desperate decision of her life. She could continue pushing Rusty, knowing the exhausted horse might collapse before they reached safety. Or she could make a stand here, using the remaining bullets to keep the wolves at bay and hoping someone from the Carson Ranch might hear the shots. Neither option promised survival. As the wolves began to circle closer, sensing the moment of decision, a distant sound cut through the gathering gloom. Barking dogs, not the howl of wolves, but the distinctive bark of domesticated hounds. Moments later, riders appeared over the second hill, heading toward her at a gallop. The wolves hesitated, then melted away into the shadows as 4 men approached, rifles ready, accompanied by a trio of baying hounds. "Hello there," the lead rider called. "You're on Carson land. State your business." "Eliza Harrington," she called. Back, her voice cracking with relief. "From Pine Creek Ranch. I'm seeking help for a sick man." The riders reached her, their expressions changing from suspicion to concern as they took in her condition, exhausted, half-frozen, alone on the frontier. "Mrs. Harrington? Matthew's wife?" The man who spoke was middle-aged, with a thick beard and kind eyes. "I'm Jeb Carson. We've been neighbors for 5 years, though we've never met." He glanced at the retreating wolf pack. "Looks like we arrived just in time." "Thomas has pneumonia," Eliza explained, her teeth chattering now that the immediate danger had passed. "He needs medicine, a doctor if possible." Jeb nodded grimly. "My wife has remedies, and my son can ride to town for the doctor tomorrow when it's light." He gestured to one of the other riders. "Give Mrs. Harrington your horse, Bill. Hers is done in. We need to get her to the house before she freezes." As they rode toward the Carson Ranch, Eliza fighting to stay conscious as reactions set in, she realized the enormity of what she had attempted and very nearly failed to achieve. The Wyoming wilderness had tested her to her limits, revealing both her courage and her foolhardiness. Yet as Trinity Basin came into view, the Carson Ranch house, glowing with lamplight against the gathering night, Eliza felt a surge of fierce pride. She had faced her fears, risked everything for the sake of a friend, and somehow survived. In that moment, the Boston society girl who had hidden behind her scar vanished completely, replaced by a woman who had found her strength in the unforgiving. Crucible of the frontier, the Carson family welcomed Eliza with frontier hospitality. No questions asked, just immediate assistance. Martha Carson, A sturdy woman with silver-streaked hair and capable hands took charge with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Get those frozen clothes off her," she ordered her daughters Emma and Sarah as soon as Eliza was brought inside. "Bring warm blankets and heat some broth." While the girls hurried to obey, Martha prepared a potent herbal concoction for Thomas. "Mullein, horehound, and wild cherry bark," she explained as she worked, "with honey to soothe the throat and whiskey to ease the pain. It won't cure pneumonia, but it might help him hold on until the doctor comes." Once Eliza had changed into dry clothes borrowed from Emma and had enough hot broth to stop her violent shivering, she told the Carsons the full story of Thomas's illness and her desperate ride through the wilderness. "You've got more spine than most men I know," Jeb Carson declared, impressed. "Riding out alone in this weather, with wolves about, that takes true grit." "I had no choice," Eliza replied. "Simply, Thomas needs help, and my husband—" She hesitated. Matthew couldn't make the journey. Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes. "Your husband is the blind rancher from Pine Creek," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eliza confirmed, her chin lifting slightly in unconscious defensiveness. Martha nodded approvingly. "I've heard he's a hard worker and a good neighbor, despite his challenges. You must be worried sick about both him and Thomas." "I am," Eliza admitted. "Matthew will be frantic by now. I promise to return before nightfall." Jeb rose immediately. "I'll take 2 of my boys and ride to Pine Creek at first light to let him know you're safe. We'll bring your Thomas back here too. Martha can tend him better with her supplies at hand, and Dr. Wilson can see him when he comes. And I'll send my oldest, Luke, to Clearwater Junction for the doctor," Martha added. "He's the fastest rider, and he knows the winter trails better than anyone." Relief washed over Eliza at their ready assistance. The frontier bred a special kind of community, people who understood that survival often depended on helping one another without hesitation or reservation. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "Nonsense," Martha replied briskly. "That's not how things work out here. Today we help you. Tomorrow you might help us. That's the only way any of us survive." Early the next morning, true to his word, Jeb Carson departed with his sons, William and James, to bring word to Matthew and transport Thomas to the Carson ranch. Luke had already left for Clearwater Junction, riding hard to fetch Dr. Wilson. Eliza, exhausted from her ordeal, slept late into the morning. When she woke, disoriented, in the unfamiliar bedroom, Emma Carson was sitting nearby, mending a shirt. "Ma said to let you sleep," the girl said with a shy smile. She was around 16, with her mother's practical demeanor but a gentler face. "You needed it after yesterday." "What time is it?" Eliza asked, sitting up in alarm. "Past 10. Pa and—" "The boys left at dawn. They should reach your place soon if the weather holds." Eliza glanced toward the window. The sky was clear, the sun creating diamond sparkles on the snow-covered landscape. "Thank God," she murmured. "Ma says you're from Boston," Emma ventured as Eliza dressed in the borrowed clothes. "What's it like there? Are there really buildings taller than trees and streets paved with stone?" The girl's curiosity was a welcome distraction from worry. As they shared breakfast in the cozy kitchen, Eliza described Boston's cobblestone streets and grand buildings, its theaters and shops, while Emma listened in fascination. "It sounds magnificent," Emma sighed when Eliza finished. "I've never been farther than Clearwater Junction." "It has its beauty," Eliza acknowledged, "but so does this place, in a different way. I've come to prefer the open skies and endless horizons." Emma studied her face for a moment, her gaze hesitating briefly on the scar before meeting Eliza's eyes directly. "Ma says you're exactly what Matthew Harrington needed. She says any fool can see with their eyes, but it takes a special kind of man to see with his heart." The simple statement, delivered with teenage earnestness, touched Eliza deeply. "Your mother is a wise woman," she said softly. The day passed with excruciating slowness as Eliza helped the Carson women with household tasks while watching the horizon for riders. Late in the afternoon, Luke returned with Dr. Wilson, a gruff but capable physician in his 60s who carried a battered medical bag and smelled faintly of whiskey. "Pneumonia, eh?" he said when Martha explained the situation. "Bad business in winter. Good thing you sent it to me." But as dusk approached with no sign of Jeb and his sons, or more importantly Matthew and Thomas, anxiety gnawed at Eliza's composure. "Something's wrong," she said to Martha as they prepared supper. "They should have been back by now." Martha's expression was carefully neutral. "Winter travel is unpredictable. Could be they're taking it slow with your Thomas, or maybe they decided to wait until morning." But Eliza sensed the older woman shared her concern. Night fell completely, and still no riders appeared. Dr. Wilson, resigned to the delay, accepted the Carsons' hospitality for the night. "Not the first time I've been caught by winter conditions," he remarked phlegmatically. "Won't be the last, I reckon." Eliza barely slept, rising frequently to check the window for any sign of approaching riders. By dawn, her nerves were stretched to breaking point. She was helping Emma feed the chickens when they heard it, the distant sound of horses approaching. They rushed to the front of the house, shading their eyes against the morning sun. 4 riders appeared over the rise, moving slowly. As they drew closer, Eliza could make out Jeb and his sons, and between them, supported on either side, a 5th figure. "Matthew," she breathed, dropping the feed bucket and running toward them, heedless of the deep snow. He was slumped in the saddle, his face pale beneath wind-burned skin. When he heard her voice, his head lifted. "Eliza?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain. "I'm here," she called, reaching the riders. "I'm safe." Relief transformed his features as Jeb helped him dismount. The moment his feet touched the ground, Eliza was in his arms, holding him so tightly she could feel his heart beating against hers. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered against her hair. "You can't get rid of me that easily," she replied, her voice wavering between laughter and tears. Jeb cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this reunion inside where it's warm. Your friend Thomas needs immediate attention." Only then did Eliza register the absence of the older ranch hand. "Where is he? Did you—" "He's alive," Matthew assured her quickly. "But weaker. William and James are bringing him in the wagon with extra blankets. They're about an hour behind us." Inside the warm kitchen, over strong coffee and Martha's freshly baked bread, Jeb explained what had happened. "We reached Pine Creek around noon yesterday," he began. "Found Matthew half out of his mind with worry, trying to saddle a horse to come looking for you, despite the fact he couldn't see where he was going." Matthew's expression was unrepentant. "I couldn't just wait there, not knowing if you were alive or dead." "Took some convincing to make him see reason," Jeb continued. "Thomas was bad off, burning with fever, struggling for every breath. We decided the wagon would be easier on him than horseback, but it meant a slower journey. We loaded him up with all the blankets and hot bricks we could find. But the weather turned," William added. "Started snowing again just as we were leaving, but decided Matthew should ride ahead with us while James stayed with the wagon. They found shelter in that old line shack on the eastern boundary when the storm got too fierce. They should be here soon," Jeb concluded. "James is a good boy. He wouldn't risk moving Thomas until he was sure it was safe." Dr. Wilson harumphed. "I'd better prepare. Pneumonia no trifling matter, especially for an older fellow who's been exposed to these temperatures." An hour later, the wagon arrived. Thomas was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin grey beneath his weathered tan. Dr. Wilson took charge immediately, ordering him carried to a bedroom where he could examine him properly. The diagnosis was grave. "Both lungs are congested," the doctor reported. "High fever, weak pulse. I won't lie to you. His chances aren't good. But he's strong for his age and stubborn from the looks of him. That counts for something. For the next 3 days, the Carson home became a hospital of sorts. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness while Dr. Wilson treated him with medicines from his bag and Martha applied her herbal remedies. Eliza and Matthew took turns sitting with him, speaking softly to the old cowboy, reminding him he had reasons to fight. On the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Thomas opened his eyes, truly aware of his surroundings for the first time since falling ill. "Did I die?" he croaked, looking around the unfamiliar room. "This doesn't look like heaven, and it sure ain't warm enough for the other place." Eliza laughed through tears of relief. "You're at Carson Ranch. You had pneumonia." Thomas's rheumy eyes focused on her. "You rode for help," he stated. Not a question. "She did," Matthew confirmed from the doorway, his face revealing the pride he felt. "Through snow and wolves and God knows what else." Thomas nodded weakly. "Always said she was a keeper." His eyes drifted closed again, but this time in healing, sleep rather than feverish unconsciousness. Dr. Wilson departed the next day, leaving strict instructions for Thomas's continued care. "No traveling for at least a week," he ordered. "Then only if the weather's fair and you can keep him warm. Pneumonia can recur if you're not careful." The Carsons insisted that their guests stay as long as necessary. "Winter's no time to be rushing." "About," Martha declared. "Besides, it's nice having another woman around. My girls are learning more from you about Eastern ways than they ever would from books." Indeed, Emma and 14-year-old Sarah had taken to following Eliza about, fascinated by her Boston manners and education. Eliza found herself teaching them everything from proper penmanship to French phrases to advanced embroidery stitches. "They'll be the most accomplished young ladies in Wyoming Territory by the time you leave," Martha observed, with a mixture of amusement and gratitude. Meanwhile, Matthew and Jeb discovered a shared interest in agricultural innovations and breeding, better livestock. They spent hours discussing new techniques Matthew had read about before losing his sight and Jeb's practical experiments on his own ranch. "Your husband has a fine mind," Jeb told Eliza one evening. "Most men out here barely think beyond the next season. He's planning years ahead." "He can't see with his eyes, so he sees with his mind," Eliza replied. "He remembers everything he reads or hears." Her voice softened. "It's one of the many things I love about him." As Thomas recovered his strength, the unexpected visit evolved from an emergency into something richer, the forging of deep friendships that would sustain both families through the challenges of frontier life. When the weather finally cleared, enough to consider the journey home, 2 weeks had passed since Eliza's desperate ride. The Carson and Harrington families had become so comfortable with one another that the impending separation was genuinely sorrowful. "You must visit again, under better circumstances," Martha insisted as they prepared to depart, "perhaps when spring comes and the roads are clear." "We'd be honored," Eliza replied, embracing the older woman who had become almost a mother figure during their stay. "And you must come to Pine Creek for a proper dinner once I've had time to prepare." The journey home was uneventful, with Thomas resting comfortably in the wagon Matthew had originally built for transporting supplies. The old ranch hand was still weak, but improving daily, his crusty personality re-emerging as his strength returned. "Never thought I'd be the cause of such a fuss," he grumbled as they crossed the boundary onto Pine Creek land. "A man can't even catch his death in peace around here." Eliza exchanged an amused glance with Matthew. Thomas's complaints were his way of expressing affection. They'd learned that long ago. As the familiar outlines of their ranch buildings appeared on the horizon, Eliza was struck by the strength of her emotional response. This place, which had been strange to her just months ago, now represented home in the deepest sense of the word. "It feels good to be back," she said softly. Matthew reached for her hand, finding it unerringly as he always did. "Home is sweeter," When you've had to fight for it, he replied. That evening, with Thomas settled comfortably in his room and the animals fed and bedded down, Eliza and Matthew sat before the fire in their own home for the first time in weeks. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his expression thoughtful, "about what happened, about your courage in riding for help." "I did what was necessary," Eliza demurred. "You did what was extraordinary," Matthew corrected, "and it made me realize something." He paused. "I've been holding back, trying to protect you from the harsher aspects of ranch life, worried that you might regret your decision to stay." Eliza considered this. "I noticed," she admitted. "You've been careful with me." "Too careful," Matthew acknowledged. "What happened with Thomas showed me that you're stronger than I gave you credit for. You're not some delicate Boston flower that needs sheltering. You're a frontier woman now, capable of facing whatever comes." The praise warmed her. "I still have much to learn, as do I," Matthew replied, "but we'll learn together as true partners." He reached for her hand. "No more protecting you from the realities of our life here. From now on, we face everything side by side." The promise filled Eliza with a sense of pride and belonging deeper than anything she had experienced before. Her journey from scarred Boston socialite to capable ranch wife had been arduous, but sitting here with Matthew, she knew she'd found her rightful place. Side by side, she agreed, sealing the pact with a kiss. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers blanketing the prairie. The harsh winter gradually released its grip, revealing a landscape transformed by renewal and growth. At Pine Creek Ranch, the change of seasons brought new beginnings in more ways than one. Thomas had recovered his health, though he complained dramatically about Eliza's continued insistence that he wear a scarf when the wind was sharp. The old cowboy had softened toward her since his illness, occasionally letting slip terms of grandfatherly endearment that made Eliza smile. Matthew had kept his promise of treating Eliza as a full partner in the ranch operations. She now helped with the cattle counts, learned to mend fences, and had even begun training a young border collie pup to someday take over Scout's duties. And there was another change, one that Eliza had confirmed with Martha Carson before they left Trinity Basin, but had waited to share with Matthew until she was certain. On a particularly beautiful April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in breathtaking colors, Eliza took Matthew's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. Matthew's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as her words registered. "A baby," he whispered. "You're sure?" "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "Martha suspected when I was ill one morning at their ranch. She's delivered enough babies to recognize the signs. It should arrive in late autumn." Matthew's hand trembled against her still flat abdomen. "A child," he murmured. "Our child." His voice caught. "I never thought, after losing my sight, I never dared to hope for this kind of future." "Are you happy?" Eliza asked, though his radiant expression had already answered her question. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," Matthew replied, drawing her into his arms. "Eliza Harrington, you've given me more than I ever dreamed possible. First your heart, and now a family." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the prairie grass around Pine Creek Ranch, Eliza rested in her husband's embrace, thinking of the incredible journey that had brought her here. From the ashes of tragedy came this unexpected joy. A scarred woman and a blind man finding in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked suddenly. "Answering my advertisement? Coming out here to marry a stranger?" Eliza considered the question seriously. "Not for a moment," she said finally. "In Boston, people could only see my scar. Here, with you, I discovered who I truly am beneath it." Matthew's fingers traced the familiar path of her scar, the touch, filled with reverence rather than pity. "And who are you?" "Eliza Harrington." She smiled, placing her hand over his. "I am a woman who found her courage in the wilderness and her heart in a blind man's vision. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming Territory, Pine Creek Ranch flourished under the combined efforts of Matthew, Eliza, and a rejuvenated Thomas. The cattle herd had grown with a successful calving season, the vegetable garden overflowed with produce, and the ranch buildings had never been better maintained. Eliza's pregnancy progressed steadily, her slender frame gradually softening with the new life growing within. Matthew would often place his hands on her expanding middle, his expression one of awe when he felt the baby's movements. Even Thomas had taken to speaking to her belly when he thought no one was listening, telling the unborn child stories of his wild youth and promising to teach it to ride as soon as its legs are long enough for stirrups. In late July, an unexpected letter arrived from Boston. Eliza recognized her sister Anne's handwriting immediately, and her heart raced as she broke the seal. She hadn't heard from Anne since leaving Massachusetts nearly a year ago. "What is it?" Matthew asked, hearing the paper crinkle as her hands trembled slightly. "A letter from my sister," Eliza replied, scanning the contents quickly. "She's coming to visit. She and her husband James are traveling to Denver on business, and she wants to continue north to see me." "That's wonderful news," Matthew said, though his tone held a note of uncertainty. "When will they arrive?" "Late August, if the trains run. On schedule." Eliza folded the letter carefully. "She writes that father isn't well. His heart, apparently. Vivian didn't want Anne to tell me." Matthew's expression softened with sympathy. Despite Eliza's complicated relationship with her father and stepmother, he understood family ties ran deep. "Are you all right?" "I'm not sure," Eliza admitted. "I haven't seen Anne in nearly 2 years, and she's never met you, never seen where I live now." She placed a protective hand over her rounded abdomen. "I wonder what she'll think of all this." "She'll see how happy you are," Matthew reassured her, reaching for her hand. "That's what matters." But as the weeks passed and Anne's visit drew closer, Eliza found herself increasingly anxious. She threw herself into preparations, cleaning the already tidy house to a gleaming polish, sewing new curtains, planning elaborate meals that showcased her newly acquired cooking skills. "You're wearing yourself out," Thomas observed gruffly, one afternoon as Eliza scrubbed the porch floorboards for the second time that week. "That can't be good for the little one." "I want everything to be perfect," Eliza replied, not pausing in her work. "Anne's only staying for 3 days. I need to show her that I'm doing well, that my life here is—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions driving her frenetic activity. "That your life here is worth the sacrifices you made?" Thomas suggested gently. "That marrying a blind rancher wasn't settling for less than you deserved." Eliza sat back on her heels, surprised by the old cowboy's perceptiveness. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "It's foolish, isn't it?" "Not foolish," Thomas said. "Natural. But unnecessary." He gestured around the thriving ranch. "This place speaks for itself, and anyone with eyes can see the way you two look at each other. That's worth more than all the fancy trappings in Boston." Eliza smiled, grateful for his reassurance. "When did you become so wise about matters of the heart, Thomas?" A shadow passed over his weathered face. "Had a wife once, long ago, lost her in childbirth along with our son." He shrugged, the casual gesture belied by the pain in his eyes. "You recognize true happiness when you've known its opposite." The revelation stunned Eliza. In all their months together, Thomas had never mentioned a wife or child. She reached out, covering his gnarled hand with hers. "I'm so sorry." "It was another lifetime," Thomas replied gruffly. "But it taught me something worth knowing. Happiness isn't about places or things. It's about people. And you've found your person in Matthew, just as he found his in you." With that simple wisdom, the old cowboy rose and ambled toward the barn, leaving Eliza to contemplate his words. When the day of Anne's arrival finally came, Eliza was a bundle of nerves. She and Matthew traveled to Clearwater Junction to meet the train, leaving Thomas to mind the ranch. As the locomotive steamed into the station, belching smoke and cinders, Eliza gripped Matthew's hand tightly. "She's here," she whispered as passengers began to disembark. The woman in the green traveling suit with the matching hat, Anne Morgan Tyler, was the picture of Eastern sophistication, her elegant attire and poised demeanor immediately setting her apart from the more practically dressed Western women on the platform. Yet beneath the fashionable exterior, she was still the sister Eliza remembered, her smile warm and genuine as she spotted Eliza. "Lizzie!" Anne exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her sister. "Oh, look at you!" She pulled back, her gaze taking in Eliza's simple dress and advanced pregnancy. "You're positively blooming." Before Eliza could respond, Anne's attention shifted to Matthew, standing patiently nearby. Her expression faltered momentarily as she registered his unseeing gaze, but recovered quickly. "And you must be Matthew. I'm Anne Tyler, Eliza's sister." A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Tyler," Matthew replied, extending his hand with unerring accuracy toward the sound of her voice. "Eliza has spoken of you often." Anne's eyebrows rose slightly at this display of capability from a man she had clearly expected to be more obviously handicapped. "Please call me Anne." She turned back to Eliza with questions in her eyes, but said only, "James sends his regrets. The business in Denver was more complicated than anticipated, so he couldn't accompany me." The drive to Pine Creek Ranch was filled with Anne's cheerful chatter about her journey, her life in California, and carefully edited news from Boston. Eliza sensed her sister was holding back, particularly regarding their father's health, but didn't press for details with Matthew present. As they created the final hill and Pine Creek Ranch came into view, Anne fell silent. Eliza watched anxiously for her reaction to the modest homestead that was so different from the elegant townhouse where they had grown up. "It's lovely," Anne said finally, her voice soft with genuine appreciation. "So open and free. I can see why you fell in love with it." Relief flooded through Eliza. "Wait until you see the creek and the wildflower meadow beyond the north pasture. It's spectacular this time of year." Thomas was waiting on the porch when they arrived, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt, Scout sitting attentively at his side. He tipped his hat to Anne with unexpected gallantry. "Welcome to Pine Creek, Mrs. Tyler. Hope your journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all, mister. Just Thomas, ma'am. Been looking after this place and this young man since before he could properly saddle a horse." He gestured toward Matthew with obvious affection. "Thomas is family," Matthew explained, his hand finding Eliza's shoulder with practiced ease. "We wouldn't be here without him." Anne's expression softened further at this evidence of the bonds between the three ranch residents. "Then I'm especially pleased to meet you, Thomas." That evening, over a dinner of roast venison, fresh bread, and vegetables from Eliza's garden, Anne witnessed firsthand the easy rhythm that had developed between her sister Matthew and Thomas. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and inside jokes that spoke of shared experiences and genuine connection. Later, as the men retired to the porch with coffee, the sisters finally had a moment alone. Anne helped Eliza clear the dishes, her movements graceful despite the unfamiliar task. "You never did this in Boston," Eliza observed with a smile. "James and I have a much smaller house in San Francisco than father's in Boston," Anne replied. "Just one maid for everything, so I've had to learn a few domestic skills." She paused, studying her sister. "But nothing like what you've mastered here. I'm impressed, Lizzie, truly." "It's not the life I imagined," Eliza admitted, "but it's become the life I want." Anne nodded thoughtfully. I can see that you're different here, more confident, more yourself somehow. Eliza touched her scar unconsciously. Matthew sees me, not my scar. It changed everything. Because he can't actually see you. Anne asked with characteristic directness. No, Eliza replied firmly. Because he chooses to see beyond appearances. He did from the beginning, even when he learned about my scar. She smiled softly. His blindness isn't why our marriage works. It's his heart. Anne considered this. I was worried when your letters became so infrequent. Father was convinced you'd made a terrible mistake coming out here. Her expression grew serious. He's been quite ill, Lizzie. Worse than what I wrote. The doctors say his heart is failing. Eliza absorbed this news silently. Her relationship with her father had fractured after he remarried, but he was still the man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride a bicycle and read Shakespeare aloud on winter evenings before the fire. Vivian doesn't want you there, Anne continued gently. But I think you should know the truth. He may not have much time left. Does he want to see me? Eliza asked the question she'd been afraid to voice since receiving Anne's letter. He doesn't say it in so many words, Anne replied diplomatically, but he keeps your photograph on his desk, the one from before the fire. The implication was clear. Her father still loved her, but couldn't face the physical reminder of the night he had lost his wife and nearly lost his daughter as well. I understand if you don't want to go back, Anne added. After how things were when you left, Eliza shook her head. It's not that simple. She glanced toward the porch where Matthew sat talking with Thomas. My life is here now. My husband, our child. I can't just leave. Of course, Anne agreed quickly. It was presumptuous of me to suggest it. Forgive me. There's nothing to forgive, Eliza assured her. Let's not waste your visit with sad topics. Tell me about San Francisco. Is it as beautiful as they say? The sisters stayed up late into the night, reconnecting and sharing stories of their separate lives. By the time they retired, Eliza felt the years and miles that had separated them melting away, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of shared history and genuine affection. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of activity, as Eliza showed Anne around the ranch and introduced her to the Carsons, who rode over specially to meet Eliza's sister. Anne charmed everyone she met, adapting to ranch life with unexpected grace and enthusiasm. She even convinced Matthew to teach her to milk a cow, laughing uproariously at her own ineptitude. I never knew you could be so carefree, Eliza remarked, as they walked by the creek on Anne's final afternoon. You were always so proper in Boston. As were you, Anne countered with a smile. Perhaps we both needed to escape to find ourselves. She linked her arm through Eliza's. I'll miss you terribly when I leave tomorrow. And I'll miss you, Eliza replied, but you'll come back when the baby arrives. I'd like that very much. Try and stop me, Anne promised. I intend to be the most doting aunt in Wyoming territory. That evening, as they sat around the hearth, Anne presented a surprise gift, a small package carefully wrapped in brown paper. It's not much, she said as Eliza unwrapped it, but when I decided to visit, I thought you might want these. Inside were several photographs, their mother holding a newborn Anne with a toddler Eliza, peering curiously at the baby. The family at the seaside, their father laughing as waves lapped at his rolled-up trousers. Eliza at 16, radiant at her first formal dance. I brought them from Father's house before I moved to California, Anne explained. I thought you might like to have them for your child, to know their history. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she held the precious images. Thank you, she whispered. I thought I'd never see these again. Matthew leaned forward. Would you describe them to me? He asked softly. I'd like to picture your family. Anne watched with glistening eyes as Eliza carefully described each photograph to Matthew, providing details only she would remember. The color of their mother's favorite shawl, the smell of salt air at the beach, the music that had played during her first dance. "He really does love you, doesn't he?" Anne murmured to Eliza later as they prepared for bed, completely without reservation. "Yes," Eliza replied simply, "and I am him." Anne nodded, satisfied. "Then I can return to San Francisco with a light heart, knowing you found true happiness." She hesitated. "And I can tell Father the same, if you'd like." Eliza considered this carefully. "Tell him I'm well and happy," she decided. "Tell him about Matthew and the baby coming, and tell him—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Tell him I understand now what it means to build a new life after loss. Perhaps that will bring him some peace." The sisters embraced. Words, unnecessary between them. Whatever happened with their father, they had renewed their own bond, strengthening the family ties that would connect their children across the miles that separated them. The next morning, Matthew and Eliza drove Anne back to Clearwater Junction. As the train whistle announced the imminent departure, Anne hugged her sister fiercely. "This isn't goodbye," she insisted. "It's just until next time. I'll be back for that baby's birth if I have to ride a horse all the way from California." Counting on it," Eliza replied, blinking back tears. As the train pulled away, Anne learned from the window to wave until she was out of sight. Eliza felt Matthew's arm encircling her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "Yes," she answered, surprised to find it was true. "I have everything I need right here." Autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in rich hues of gold, crimson, and bronze. The air grew crisp, the days shorter, and at Pine Creek Ranch, anticipation grew as Eliza's time drew near. Martha Carson visited regularly, bringing baby clothes she and her daughters had sewn and practical advice about childbirth and infant care. "First babies often take their time," she reassured Eliza. "But when yours decides to come, send one of your men for me right away. I've helped bring more children into this world than I can count." Thomas had taken to sleeping in the house rather than his quarters above the barn, just in case. He'd become increasingly protective as Eliza's due. Date approached, fussing over her in his gruff way that fooled no one about his tender heart. "That child's going to have 3 parents, the way he carries on," Matthew joked one evening, as they watched Thomas arrange extra blankets in the cradle he'd crafted by hand. 4, if you count Martha," Eliza replied with a smile. "And that's not counting the extended family with the Carsons." "It's good," Matthew said softly. "When I lost my sight, I thought I'd lost the possibility of family too. Now look at us." November arrived with the first dusting of snow and winds that rattled the windows at night. Eliza, her body unwieldy with the fullness of advanced pregnancy, found herself counting days, wondering when their child would finally make an appearance. The answer came on a quiet Tuesday morning as Eliza was kneading bread dough. The first contraction took her by surprise, sharp enough to make her gasp. "Eliza?" Matthew called from the main room where he was repairing a bridle. "What is it?" "I think—" She paused as another contraction followed quickly. "I think the baby's coming now." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Thomas rode for Martha Carson, returning with her in record time. Matthew paced anxiously as women took over the bedroom, boiling water, preparing linens, and issuing instructions that no one dared disobey. Labor was long and difficult. Outside, snow began to fall heavily, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, Eliza fought through wave after wave of pain, Martha's steady encouragement her only anchor. "You're doing fine, child," the older woman soothed. "The baby's just taking its time, making sure everything's perfect for its arrival." As evening approached, Matthew sat in the kitchen with Thomas, listening helplessly to Eliza's muffled cries from the bedroom. "She'll be all right," Thomas assured him, though his own face was pale with worry. "Martha knows what she's doing." Hours passed. The snow continued to fall. Thomas built up the fire and made coffee that neither man drank. Matthew prayed silently, bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening to protect Eliza and their child. Finally, as midnight approached, a new sound pierced the tense silence, the indignant wail of a newborn child drawing its first breath. Matthew froze, his heart pounding as he awaited further news. Minutes later, Martha emerged, her face tired but triumphant. "Congratulations, Mr. Harrington. You have a beautiful, healthy daughter." Thomas whooped with joy, slapping Matthew on the back. "A girl, hear that? A little miss to wrap us all around her finger." Matthew stood shakily. "And Eliza, is she—" "Exhausted but fine," Martha assured him. "She's asking for you." Guided by Thomas, Matthew made his way to the bedroom, where Eliza lay propped against pillows, their tiny daughter cradled in her arms. The room smelled of sweat and blood and something indefinitely new, the scent of birth and beginning. "Matthew," Eliza's voice was weary but radiant with joy. "Come meet your daughter." He approached cautiously, sitting on the edge of the bed. With gentle hands, Eliza placed the swaddled infant in his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, yet in that moment he felt the full weight of love and responsibility settle on his shoulders. "She's perfect," Eliza said softly. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a good strong cry. Matthew traced his daughter's features. With a trembling finger, the delicate arch of eyebrows, the button nose, the impossibly tiny lips. "What does she look like? Tell me everything." "She has your dark hair," Eliza began, her voice tender. "And I think she'll have your smile. Her eyes are blue now, as all babies are, but they might change. And her skin is so soft," as Eliza described their daughter, painting a picture with words that Matthew could see in his mind. Tears slid unheeded down his cheeks. This miracle, in his arms, this perfect blend of himself and the woman he loved, represented everything he had once thought beyond his reach. "What shall we name her?" he asked when Eliza finished her description. "I was thinking of Grace," Eliza replied. "Grace Ann Harrington. Grace for all we've been given that we never expected to find. And Ann for my sister, who still believes in family despite everything." "It's beautiful," Matthew agreed. "Perfect for her." As the snow fell silently outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, the three of them, Matthew, Eliza, and baby Grace, formed a tableau of contentment. Beyond the bedroom door, Thomas and Martha kept watch, newfound grandparents in all but blood. And miles away in Boston, a dying man held a photograph of his daughter before the fire, remembering and perhaps regretting. But here at Pine Creek Ranch, on this snowy November night, there was only joy and fulfillment, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a scarred woman's desperate gamble and a blind man's lonely advertisement. "We found each other," Eliza murmured sleepily, her hand finding Matthew's where it cradled their daughter. "Against all odds." "No," Matthew corrected gently, "not against the odds. Perhaps this was always where we were meant to be, finding, in each other's imperfections, our own perfect match." As baby Grace slept peacefully between them, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that Matthew was right. Her scar had led her here, to this man who saw her true beauty, to this life rich with meaning and love. What had once seemed a mark of tragedy had become, in the end, her path to happiness. 5 years passed in the rhythms of ranch life, seasons of planting and harvest, calving and roundup, blizzards and sunshine. Pine Creek Ranch prospered under Matthew and Eliza's stewardship, growing from a modest homestead into one of the most successful operations in the county. Little Grace Harrington was no longer a baby, but a spirited 5-year-old with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. She raced across the ranch with boundless energy, equally at home in the kitchen with Eliza or in the barn with Matthew and Thomas. Despite her young age, she had already developed an uncanny ability to describe the world to her father in vivid detail, instinctively understanding the importance of her words to his perception. "The sunset is painting. The sky orange and pink today, Papa," she would announce, perched on Matthew's lap on the porch after supper, "and there are purple clouds shaped like horses galloping over the mountains." On a warm June morning in 1890, Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching Matthew and Grace in the corral. Matthew was teaching their daughter to groom her pony, his hands guiding hers over the brush in long, smooth strokes. Grace's face was a study in concentration, determined to master this new skill. "She's going to be a fine horsewoman," Thomas observed, coming to stand beside Eliza. The years had bent him further, adding silver to his hair and lines to his face, but had done nothing to diminish his devotion to the family. Just like her. "Father," Eliza agreed with a smile. Thomas nodded. "Got his way with animals, that's for certain." He hesitated. "Speaking of which, the mail came. There's a letter from your sister." Eliza took the envelope, recognizing Anne's elegant handwriting immediately. The sisters had maintained a faithful correspondence since Anne's visit, exchanging news of their lives and families. Anne had indeed returned for Grace's birth, and had visited twice more since then, the most recent time bringing her own 2 children to meet their cousin. Breaking the seal, Eliza scanned the contents quickly, her expression growing serious. "Bad news?" Thomas asked, noting the change. "My father has died," Eliza said quietly. "The funeral was last month. Anne only just learned of it herself. Apparently Vivian didn't inform her immediately." Thomas placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Eliza. Even with complicated feelings, losing a parent cuts deep." Eliza nodded, still absorbing the news. Her relationship with her father had remained unresolved, neither reconciled nor explicitly severed. Now it never would be. "There's more," she continued, reading further. "Anne says there are some legal matters requiring my attention. Father's will, he left me something. She doesn't specify what." "Will you go to Boston?" Thomas asked. Eliza folded the letter carefully. "I don't know. It's been 6 years since I left. I'm not sure I belong there anymore." "Sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones that take us back to where we started," Thomas observed philosophically. "But we never return as the same person who left." The words lingered with Eliza as she went about her chores, their wisdom gently nudging her toward a decision. By evening, when she and Matthew sat alone before the fire after Grace had been tucked into bed, she had made up her mind. "I need to go to Boston," she told him, explaining Anne's letter. "It might be the only way to truly close that chapter of my life." Matthew listened intently, his expression thoughtful. What about Grace? Such a long journey would be difficult for a child her age. "She could stay here with you and Thomas," Eliza suggested. "It would only be for a few weeks. Or," she hesitated, "you could both come with me. Grace should know something of her maternal heritage, and Boston in summer can be lovely." Matthew was silent for a long moment, considering. "I haven't been back east since losing my sight," he said finally. "The idea of navigating a city again is daunting." "You wouldn't be alone," Eliza reminded him gently. "And perhaps it would be good for Grace to see the world beyond Wyoming, to understand there are different ways of living." In the end, they decided all 3 would make the journey. Thomas would remain behind to manage the ranch with help from Jeb Carson's oldest son, who had become a trusted assistant over the years. Preparations for such an extensive trip took time. There were arrangements to be made, suitable clothing to be sewn, and 1,000 details to attend to. Grace was beside herself with excitement at the prospect of a train journey and couldn't stop asking questions about the mysterious Boston, where her mother had grown up. Finally, on a clear July morning, the family departed for Clearwater Junction, the first leg of their long journey east. Thomas stood in the yard, Scout's aging successor Rex at his side, watching until the wagon disappeared over the hill. "Take care of them," he whispered to whatever forces might be listening, "and bring them safely home." The transcontinental journey was a revelation for Grace, who pressed her face against the train window for hours, exclaiming over every new sight. Matthew listened attentively to her descriptions, smiling at her childish wonder. For Eliza, the experience was more complex, each mile bringing her closer to a past she had deliberately left behind. After nearly a week of travel, they arrived in Boston. The city's hustle and noise was overwhelming after the vast quietude of Wyoming. Grace clung to Matthew's hand, suddenly shy amidst the crowds and clamor. Anne met them at the station, embracing Eliza warmly before greeting Matthew and marveling at how Grace had grown since her last visit west. "You must be exhausted," she said, guiding them to a waiting carriage. "I've prepared rooms for you at our home. James is looking forward to seeing you all." As they traveled through Boston's streets, Eliza pointed out landmarks to Grace: the common Faneuil Hall, the elegant townhouses of Beacon Hill. The city had changed in her absence, yet remained essentially the same. There was a surreal quality to revisiting places that had once been the backdrop of her daily life, now viewed through the perspective of years and distance. Anne's home was a handsome brownstone in a fashionable neighborhood, comfortable without being ostentatious. Her husband James, a successful attorney with a ready smile and genuine warmth, welcomed them graciously. Their children, Edward and Charlotte, immediately took their cousin Grace under their wing, eager to show her their toys and books. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, the adults gathered in the parlor and poured sherry for everyone before addressing the reason for their journey. "Father's will was quite specific," she began. "Most of his estate went to Vivian, of course, but he made separate provisions for each of us." She handed Eliza a sealed envelope. "This explains everything. His solicitor gave it to me for you." Eliza broke the seal with slightly trembling fingers. Inside was a formal legal document and a personal letter written in her father's familiar hand. She read the latter first, Matthew sitting close beside her. "My dearest Elizabeth, if you are reading this, I have passed from this world without having found the courage to face you in person. This failure will be among my greatest regrets in the hereafter. After your mother's death and your injury, I could not bear to look upon your scarred face without being reminded of my failure to protect you both. This was my weakness, not yours. In my grief, I retreated from the person who needed me most, you. Then I compounded this failing by bringing Vivian into our broken home, foolishly believing that a new wife could somehow mend what was shattered. By the time I realized my mistakes, you had gone, seeking elsewhere the acceptance and love I had withheld. Anne tells me you have found both with your husband in Wyoming. For this, I am profoundly grateful. I cannot undo the past, but I can offer you this small token of atonement. I have set aside funds for you, equal to what would have been your dowry had circumstances been different. Use it as you see fit, to secure your future, to expand your ranch, to provide for your child whom I regret I will never know. Accompanying this letter is the deed to your mother's family cottage on the North Shore. It was her favorite place, as I believe it was once yours. I have maintained it all these years, unable to part with this last physical connection to her. It seems right that it should now pass to you. Please forgive an old man's failures if you can. Know that despite all evidence to the contrary, you were always loved. Your father." Henry Morgan. Tears slid silently down Eliza's cheeks as she finished reading. The letter offered no dramatic revelations, no complete absolution, only the imperfect, belated attempts at connection from a flawed man who had died before finding the courage to make proper amends. "He left me mother's cottage," she told Matthew, her voice thick with emotion, "and a substantial sum of money. The cottage by the sea, where did we spend summers when we were girls?" Anne asked, her own eyes glistening. "He never let anyone use it after Mother died. I always wondered why. He kept it. He couldn't let go," Eliza realized. Just as he couldn't face my scar, both were reminders of what he'd lost. Matthew took her hand. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Eliza replied slowly. "It's not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. We were both trapped by the past in different ways." The next day, Eliza asked the carriage driver to take a detour, past her father's house, the grand residence on Commonwealth Avenue where she had grown up. The mansion looked much as she remembered, its imposing facade conveying wealth and position. Yet it no longer intimidated her. It was simply a house, not the fortress of painful memories she had carried in her mind. "That's where you lived, Mama?" Grace asked, wide-eyed at the grandeur. "Once," Eliza replied, "but it was never really home, not the way Pine Creek is." Later that week they traveled north to visit the seaside cottage her father had left her. Unlike the Boston mansion, this place held mostly happy memories of sandcastles and seashells, of her mother's laughter and simple family pleasures before tragedy intervened. The cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its weathered shingles and blue shutters, just as Eliza remembered. Inside, the rooms were smaller than in her childhood recollections, but filled with comfortable furniture and mementos of summers past. Matthew stood on the porch, face turned toward the sound of crashing waves and the scent of salt air. "I can see why you loved it here," he said. "It sounds like freedom." Grace raced along the beach below, picking up shells and calling for Eliza to come see her treasures. Watching her daughter's uninhibited joy, Eliza felt a sense of completion. Circle somehow closing. "I'd like to keep it," she told Matthew that evening as they sat on the porch, listening to the rhythmic surge of waves. "Not to live in, but perhaps to visit occasionally, a place where Grace can know something of her grandmother and her Eastern heritage." "I think that's wise," Matthew agreed. "Our lives are in Wyoming, but it's good to honor where we came from." They stayed in Massachusetts for nearly a month, dividing their time between Boston and the cottage. Eliza reconnected with a few old acquaintances, surprised to find that many barely noticed her scar anymore. Or if they did, it no longer defined their perception of her. Whether this was because they had changed or because she carried herself differently, she couldn't say. Perhaps it was both. Vivian, her stepmother, declined to see them, a decision that brought more relief than disappointment. Some relationships were better left in the past. Before they departed, Eliza made arrangements with a local bank to manage her inheritance, setting up accounts that would provide for Grace's education and security while investing the remainder to benefit Pine Creek Ranch. The cottage she placed in Anne's care, with the understanding that both families would use it for summer visits when possible. "I hate saying goodbye," Anne confessed on their last evening together. "It never gets easier." "It's not goodbye," Eliza assured her. "It's just until next time. Wyoming isn't as remote as it once seemed. And now we have two places to meet. Your home and Mother's cottage." The journey back to Wyoming felt shorter somehow, perhaps because they were traveling toward home rather than away from it. As the landscape transformed from the crowded eastern cities to the expansive western plains, Eliza felt her spirit expanding with it. Grace, now thoroughly a seasoned traveler at 5 years old, entertained her fellow passengers with detailed comparisons of Boston and Wyoming, delivered with the absolute authority of childhood. Matthew listened proudly, occasionally adding his own observations about the differences in sounds and smells between city and ranch life. When at last they created the familiar hill overlooking Pine Creek Ranch, the sight of home brought tears to Eliza's eyes. Thomas and Rex stood waiting in the yard, the old cowboy waving his hat in greeting. Behind him, the ranch buildings gleamed with fresh paint, Thomas's welcome home gift, he later explained. "So," he asked that evening, after Grace had exhausted herself recounting their adventures and had been tucked into bed, "did you find what you needed in Boston?" Eliza considered the question carefully. "I found peace with my past," she said finally, "and appreciation for my present. And that's enough," Thomas pressed gently. "More than enough," she assured him, glancing at Matthew across the room. "I have everything that truly matters right here." Life at Pine Creek quickly reclaimed its familiar rhythms, though subtly altered by their experiences in the East. Eliza wrote to Anne more frequently, planning future visits in both directions. Matthew incorporated some of the agricultural innovations he had learned about during their journey. And Grace, enriched by exposure to different ways of living, developed an even more vivid, descriptive vocabulary, a gift that continued to bridge the gap between her father's darkness and the visual world. The money from Henry Morgan's estate allowed for improvements to the ranch, modern equipment, additional grazing land, even hired help that gave Eliza and Matthew more time to focus on family life. Yet these material advantages were secondary to the emotional wealth they had cultivated over the years. On the one-year anniversary of their Boston journey, Eliza sat on the porch with Matthew after Grace had gone to bed. The night was clear, the stars sprawling across the Wyoming sky in breathtaking profusion. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness, "about scars and blindness, and how what seems like tragedy can lead to unexpected blessings." "How so?" Eliza asked, though she thought she knew where his thoughts were leading. "If you hadn't been scarred in that fire, you might have married some Boston gentleman and never come west," Matthew reflected. "If I hadn't lost my sight, I might never have learned to truly see people for who they are, rather than how they appear." Eliza reached for his hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after years together. "Our wounds brought us together, and healed us both in the process," Matthew added. As they sat in companionable silence, Eliza thought about the long journey that had brought her from a scarred, rejected young woman in Boston to this moment of complete contentment. The physical scar remained, of course, a permanent reminder etched into her skin, but its power to define her had long since faded. What remained was the life she and Matthew had built together, a flourishing ranch, a beautiful daughter, deep friendships with the Carsons and other neighbors, and the steadfast presence of Thomas, whose gruff affection had become as essential as family. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we'd made different choices?" Matthew asked suddenly. "If you hadn't answered my advertisement, or if I'd been honest about my blindness from the start?" "Sometimes," Eliza admitted. "But then I look at our life here, at all we've built and all we've become together, and I know we ended up exactly where we were meant to be." Matthew raised her hand to his lips. The mail-order bride with a scarred face, and the blind rancher, he mused with a smile. "Who would have thought we'd be the lucky ones?" "I think," Eliza replied softly, "that we created our own luck by being brave enough to see beyond appearances, to recognize value where others saw only flaws." As the night deepened around them, and the sounds of their beloved ranch settled into peaceful slumber, Eliza Morgan Harrington knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginning, led precisely where they should, not to perfection, but to wholeness, which was infinitely more valuable. Her scar had once seemed a curse, closing doors and limiting possibilities. Instead, it had become the key that unlocked her true destiny, leading her to a man whose blindness gave him unique vision, to a life rich with purpose and meaning, and to the profound understanding that true beauty emerges not despite our wounds, but because of how we transcend them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.